Hi, I'm Charles Carson, Associate Professor of Musicology and Ethnomusicology here at the Butler School of Music at UT Austin, where I teach a range of classes from Beethoven to Bartok to Bird. And I'm really happy to be able to join you today to talk a little bit about Beethoven's wonderful magnum opus opera, Fidelio. The best way probably to begin is with a little bit of an overview of the plot. I don't like to go point by point and give away too much, but I think just having a little sense of the structure and what's going to happen will help orient us a little bit in this piece. It's not so confusing. It's not as confusing as some of the other operas in the repertoire, but there are a lot of twists and turns. The key thing to realize is the name of the opera, Fidelio, refers in a sort of a way to the main character, who is in fact a woman by the name of Leonora. Leonora is dressed up like a boy, in this case. She's taken the name Fidelio, in an effort to save her husband, Florestan, who has been imprisoned by his sort of political rival, a guy by the name of Don Pizarro. And Pizarro has thrown him in the sort of basement of the dungeon, like below the jail, in an effort to sort of hide him away, where he eventually intends to kill him with the help of the jailer Rocco. Rocco has a daughter, Marcelina, who has fallen in love with Fidelio. So evidently was a pretty good costume, right? Leonora dressed up pretty well, pretty convincing. At the same time, Joaquino is sort of helper to the jailer. Joaquino himself is in love with Marcelina. So there's a little bit of a love, I've lost track, quadrangle. I don't know. That sort of motivates a lot of the sort of scenes of the story, but ultimately, the problem is that Don Fernando, who is Don Pizarro's boss, has heard that Don Pizarro is very, very cruel at this prison and has decided to send an envoy to sort of check it out himself. And that is really the sort of ticking, the sort of the clock that is adding sort of pressure to this. If Don Fernando arrives and sees Florestan imprisoned, it will prove that Pizarro is in fact as cruel, and Pizarro doesn't want this to happen. So he has at the beginning of the story, we're really at this point where Pizarro has to do something with Florestan. That's really the motivating structure. So the entire story actually centers around this woman and her love for her husband. The best place to start might be by giving you a little bit of background about the piece. The piece is based on kind of a popular work of the day, and it's very much in this tradition of post um, uh, French Revolution and then post Reign of Terror works that are really dealing with sort of freedom, both politically, individually, right? And the work itself, Beethoven originally composed it and premiered it in 1805 in the original version. That version for Vienna was in 3 acts. The initial premiere and the initial version of the work in 3 acts kind of floundered. Beethoven revised it the following year. Into a 2 act version that was a little tighter, but that work wasn't satisfactory either. About a decade later, in 1814, Beethoven revisited the 2 act version and completely rewrote large sections and large arias for it. And that is the version that we typically experience today. That 2 act version is 2 acts and 2 scenes per act. And it's a pretty fast moving work. I mean, it's 2.5 hours, depending on tempo. It follows a typical sort of scene and aria kind of structure that was very popular in the late 18th and early 19th century, coming out of the traditions of Mozart. So you'll have a scene set up musically through some kind of action and interaction between characters. That will follow by recitative, which is in the opera world kind of the onstage speaking technique, where singers will sing along the lines of prose speech rhythms, so it's not necessarily melodic in a traditional song way. They're accompanied, in the case of Beethoven, by the full orchestra, sort of jabbing and answering their sentences and their phrases. That's the dialogue of the opera. That's when people on stage are sort of speaking to each other. That will then transition into the aria proper. And the aria is the song. It's the sort of poetry of the opera scenes. So if you think about it like a soliloquy in Shakespeare, where someone steps aside and speaks to the heavens or something. That's really how arias are functioning in classical opera of this era. The aria itself often is broken up into two kind of mini sections, a sort of slower, more reflective sort of section, and then there's a turn, something that happens dramatically into maybe a quicker, more energetic section. And that's used to sort of move the drama, move the narrative forward out of the song and back into the structure of the story, right? So that the aria kind of exists outside of that, but then there's a turn like, let's get back to work. And so you have an opportunity for singers to sort of sing lyrically and then also showcase a little bit more technique. So this is the typical structure of an opera during this period. And for that matter, this is a pretty traditional example of 18th century, late 18th, early 19th century opera. The work itself is kind of interesting. We can think about it from the point of view of kind of three angles. One, we can think about it in terms of the history of opera, where Beethoven is inheriting the opera tradition of the masters, Mozart, namely, who's at this time is considered to be the greatest opera composer. And that tradition of these, what we call number operas, where something happens and there's a very like scene, recitative, aria, over and over again. And Beethoven is drawing heavily from that tradition, so it's very clear structurally. But he's also doing some interesting things with the drama by smoothing out some of the edges of the numbers of the individual tunes that make up the opera. This will prefigure a lot of the stuff of the later generation, right? So if we think about it in the opera tradition, he's sort of moving us from Mozart and Rossini, who's working at the same time, into the kinds of stuff that would set up the smoother transition, the smoother structures of people like obviously Wagner and Verdi, the two great people who inherit the tradition from Mozart, let's say, right? So he's a nice bridge between those two. We can also think about it as a bridge in Beethoven's own output. In Beethoven's own career, historians love to put Beethoven in sort of three periods, early, middle, and late. The middle period being what we think of as sort of the heroic period. He's writing works like the Third Symphony. He's writing pieces that are about, humanism, about freedom, about this new world of Europe that's emerging at the end of the 18th century. And one of the things that we see in this piece is that theme, heroism, right? So Fidelio, faithful, true. As a character, right? She is a heroine. She is a hero, capital H. But Beethoven's later period, the later Beethoven period, was characterized by more introspection, a little bit deeper kind of spiritual and thoughtfulness, and more experimentation. And we see that here too, because remember the piece was sort of written at the sort of peak of his heroic period, but he revises it later in what we might more traditionally think of as the late Beethoven period. So we have this nice blend of Beethoven's heroic style with these clear like trumpet calls and fists thrust forward, and we also have a little bit more of this experimentation with some structure and smoothing some of these lines out, and also some nice, really interesting harmonic writing. The piece itself, we can also think about in the third way as being part of this German art music tradition and the bridge, like Beethoven was, into German Romanticism. And I already mentioned how works like this would prefigure composers like, Wagner, but also von Weber, who's influencing Wagner, and to a certain extent, the Italian composers like Verdi. These things are all part of this tradition of this Germanic push towards Romanticism. And Romanticism during this period is very much characterized by this balance between public and private that would become very important in 19th century opera. And you see that here, this sort of domestic love, this very pure love between this man and this woman within the context of this very large political movement. So whenever I talk to anyone about opera, I like to give just a few highlights, a few things to look for to sort of help you sort of map your way through a performance. They're like signposts, just so you know kind of where you are in the work and where you're coming from and where you're going to, and that can help sort of pace out and help kind of hold the piece in your head a little bit over what sometimes is hours and hours and hours of music. Today, we don't have quite as much of that to worry about, so I'm just going to limit it to, let's say, 2 per act, 2 moments per act. There are beautiful, too many to name, beautiful moments, but I feel like if you have just 1 or 2 per act, just to sort of think about and look forward to and then sort of react to, that can really help you orient yourself a little bit. In Act 1, there's so much to choose from, but I'm going to choose one of the big first early highlights, which is Fidelio, or Leonora, their first aria, in which they sing. It's after this moment where they overhear Pizarro speak to the jailer and plot to actually murder Florestan before Don Fernando comes to sort of out Pizarro's treachery. And at that moment, overhearing this, Fidelio / Leonora, exclaims like, "What a monster!" And you hear like this sort of bubbling up of frustration and anger in her voice. And then there's this beautiful moment where there's this like a clearing of the clouds, and you hear this beautiful these nice horns that come in and signal this sort of moment of realization for her about the love that she has and what she will do for her husband. The aria proper is often referred to as Cum Hoffnung, or Come Hope. It's we generally say the hymn to hope. It's a beautiful, beautiful example of a character aria, an aria that tells you about the complexity of the character. During the first half of this sort of stormy first half, we learn about her power and we learn about how strong and heroic this woman is. But during the second half, right, Cum Hoffnung, we learn about the depth of her love. And so it's very powerful as a musical tool to tell us pretty early on exactly who we're dealing with. And that will help to move the narrative forward as we see her in a lot of increasingly dangerous situations. The second big moment in Act 1, and this is perhaps one of the most famous moments in the opera, is the chorus that the prisoners sing, right? It's this beautiful, beautiful moment. Plot-wise, Fidelio / Leonora is sort of coercing Rocco the jailer to let the prisoners out into the courtyard for a moment, because she wants to check and try to find Florestan herself. With the help of Marcelina, again, who is in love with her, they convince, in love with Fidelio, let's get that right, they convince Rocco to let them out for a moment. When they finish that, once they sort of have finished that convincing, there's this beautiful moment where all the prisoners start to come out of these cells and out of these dungeons and whatnot, and in doing that, they sing, "What joy," right? Oh, what joy! Oh, welche Lust, right? And this sense of this hymn to freedom, really, is what it is. It's very much about the time. It's very much about what was going on in politically in Europe during this era, that these individuals who were being oppressed are singing about this moment of joy, however fleeting. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment, a very powerful moment, not only in this opera, but in Western art music. This brings us to Act 2. The opening of Act Two is very, very, very effective, and it opens after a little bit of an orchestra interlude. It opens with really Florestan's signature aria. And this is looking back at Beethoven's sketches, this is the aria that gave him the most trouble, that he rewrote and sort of was plagued by a lot, just really how to get this sense. Because it really is a kind of moment of deep profundus, from the depths, rising up. He sings, oh, what darkness, welche Dunkelheit, this idea of, I'm so in the depths of despair, literally physically in darkness in the bottom of this dungeon, and what do I have to live for? Like, why am I here? And then the turn in this aria is this moment where he remembers the love of his wife, and he remembers he has a vision of her coming to save him, and everything kind of turns, and he remembers like back in spring and the happiness of days gone by, as he sort of collapses and falls asleep. But it's a very, very, very interesting opera aria, in that it really feels at times like Beethoven is speaking to us, that this guy who kind of lived a very, very rough life, he is singing from this place of kind of darkness and despair, and really yearning for some kind of light and some kind of hope. And it feels very much autobiographical in that way. And in terms of the narrative, it's a beautiful moment, harrowingly beautiful moment, to move us through this opening of the second act into what is effectively his moment that he fully expects to die very quickly. The last signpost that I think would be useful isn't actually a very, it's not an aria, it's not a big famous chorus. This is the beginning of the quartet that involves Florestan, Fidelio Leonora, Rocco, and of course Don Pizarro. It opens with Don Pizarro saying, sterbe, let him die. When Pizarro's himself come down to the dungeon in order to himself dispatch Florestan by hand, he says he's going to die, but first I want him to know that it was I who killed him. And so in this moment of sort of like coming face to face with his rival, we have this beautiful moment where Fidelio, Leonora, reveals herself. It's like, no, if you're going to kill him, you have to kill me first, his wife. And everything is thrown, overboard, and they're sort of, fighting back and forth. And then all of a sudden, there is a trumpet call from off stage. Now, if you're familiar with anything with like playwriting technique or anything, the phrase Chekhov's gun, with the playwright Chekhov referred to this device where he said, if you introduce a gun in Act 1, someone gets shot in Act 3. That's just how narrative works. We have an interesting case in Fidelio, in which we have sort of a Chekhov's trumpet situation. Early in the opera, they set up this idea. Don Fernando's coming. We have to kill him before. This is at the very beginning of the opera. We have to kill Florestan before he arrives to cover our tracks. And Don Pizarro says, place a trumpeter at the gate. So when we see him arriving, the trumpeter will sound the alarm and we'll know before he arrives. So that's sort of like planting the seed. And here we are at this moment where they're struggling back and forth, and all of a sudden off stage you hear the trumpet call. So it's an interesting moment. We have this quartet where they're bickering back and forth, and then it's interrupted by this trumpet call. And then there's a bunch of shuffling as Don Fernando comes in, and then eventually, rarely for opera, happily ever after does occur. But this is a really interesting structural moment when I talked earlier about Beethoven sort of smoothing out these lines of the number opera by using sort of dramatic musical moments. This is one of those moments. So that's the opera. Let's talk a little bit about the music. There's so much here to talk about in terms of Beethoven and his musical style. Through the composition of these various versions, he composed many overtures. As many as 4 versions of the overture exist. The version we use today, we refer to as Fidelio. It is the version that is performed at the front of the opera in common performances. But the most popular and arguably the best version is referred to as Leonora Number 3. So Leonora was the working title of the opera, and so his early drafts of the overtures had that title. And the third version of that, Number 3, is actually still a masterwork of the Western art music curriculum and canon, because it's a standalone orchestral piece that's really well constructed as sort of a large symphonic work. That often gets performed as both as a solo piece, as a sort of concert overture, but sometimes in some productions they even insert it into the sort of the transition into the end of the last scene of Act 2 as sort of like a big last hurrah kind of orchestral piece. Vocally, the writing is actually very difficult, and it's the kind of frustrating version of difficult, because it doesn't sound, this isn't bel canto like the Italian masters of the sort of next generation. It's not that sort of like fast flowery kind of thing. It's very like a lot of Beethoven's vocal writing. It's very instrumental. It demands a certain amount of sort of a control and very important pitch and harmonic motions throughout the sort of lineup with musical themes that are happening within the orchestra. And those moments, I think, are devilishly difficult to sing for vocalists. And I think that's something that we have to remember. I mean, Beethoven is not really known as an opera composer. This is his only opera, but he brings to bear the forces of all of his experience of writing these monumental orchestral and choral works, and brings that to bear on high drama. So when we listen to stuff like the Choral Fantasy, or even famously the Ninth Symphony, he's using these skills and now towards a dramatic end. So it's very, very interesting, very powerful musical writing that I hope you enjoy. So the last little fun thing, just some trivia, just some interesting things about this. We've already talked about how Beethoven's process was about sketching and sketching and sketching. And this opera, as a large-scale work, was no different. He sketched so much of this and worked through sketches so much. This is how we know so much about the process behind creating the opera, is we have all these sketchbooks that tell us about changes both structurally but then also musically to the work. So that's something that's really interesting about this versus a lot of other opera works. He said that this is the piece that he labored the most towards, and therefore it's one that's the closest to his heart. but not close enough, I guess, to write a follow up for it. This again is fascinating, given Beethoven's purported disposition. He was not a very nice guy. Didn't seem to be a very happy guy. Very, if you will, unlucky in love. And here's a person writing about kind of purest forms of love and joy. And you have to believe that this was an outlet for him, that this was a way in which he was able to express that which he was lacking in his own life. That's pretty much it. I don't want to take too much more of your time. I hope I get to see you live and in person at one of our performances. But barring that, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say, and I hope it helps you enjoy the opera just a little bit more. Thank you very much.